Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the SWAN North America Alliance webinar hosted by Frost and Sullivan. Today's event is titled Cybersecurity Threats and Opportunities in a Digitally Transformed Water Utility Industry. My name is Anna, and I oversee Frost and Sullivan's Growth, Innovation, and Leadership briefings. Before we begin our event today, I'd like to go over a few quick notes. The presentation will be available immediately on demand. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and you can do that by clicking on the Ask a Question button. You can also safely share this briefing at any time by clicking on the Share button. On today's presentation, we will have some detailed slides, so there is a full screen feature available to you at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. At this time, I'd like to hand this over to our moderator, Seth Cutler.
Great. Thank you, Anna, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today and those that are listening on the webinar through the archive. For the next 45 to 60 minutes, the panel, which I'm about to introduce, will lead us through some great content on cybersecurity issues in the water industry. Certainly relevant in the news lately with global cyber intrusions and data security and privacy issues, taking some time today to discuss the real and potential impacts that cybersecurity has, or maybe a lack thereof, is of great importance for the industry. Utility intrusion is very much seen as a threat and an area where a lot of work needs to be done overall to ensure safety and security. Just to repeat, Anna, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Do feel free to send across questions using the on-screen button. To quickly introduce today's panel presenters, in speaking order, we have Kevin Morley, Manager of Federal Relations at the American Water Works Association, Matt Scholl, Chief of the Computer Security Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Information Technology Lab, and John Kassel, Principal Consultant at Black & Veatch. Our speakers today will deliver a range of information, including frameworks and best practices to address cybersecurity in the water industry, down to specific challenges and solutions. Just before we kick things off, what I'd like to do is a little bit of housekeeping and updates on the Alliance. It's my pleasure really to have Gary Wong with us on the webinar today. Gary's the Alliance's new chairman. He joins the Alliance as the Global Water Industry Principal at OSIsoft, which hopefully you know, but they're very much a leader in real-time operational intelligence for the industry. They're also a key SWAN member globally. The Alliance very much appreciates Gary's and OSIsoft's support in promoting the understanding and adoption of smart water solutions in the water industry. With him, Gary brings over 20 years of extensive international experience around sustainable, strategic, and cost-effective solutions in the water industry. Gary, it's great to have you with us today, and I'm happy for you to share a few words and kick things off for the webinar. Then you can hand things over to Kevin. Gary?
Great. Thanks so much, Seth. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. So at SWAN, we really wanted to raise the awareness of cybersecurity and the importance of it, because most of the time it's often taken for granted, or cybersecurity, is just an afterthought. Oftentimes we don't hear about a utility or who's been hacked. It's something that might be embarrassing, so it's usually not talked about. Today, being able to talk about it and hear from some of our great speakers and experts is a fantastic way to think about prevention first as a mindset, because as water utilities, we are vulnerable. So without further ado, let me pass it off to Kevin, and he can kick it off. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, it's my pleasure to join y'all today for this important conversation. Certainly, there has been a significant amount of discussion and activity related to cybersecurity incidents here in the past week, and I'll touch on that a little bit, but also share with you some resources to kind of help water utilities navigate this space. So first I'd like to begin with what may be obvious, but oftentimes perhaps isn't necessarily fully accounted for, and I think John will talk about this a little bit more later. But you really have two dimensions within the utility realm of the OT side, or process control systems, that capture some of those core fundamentals of SCADA and telecommunications, and even the HVAC system at your plant, at your admin building. But I think, as we all know, there's increasing advancements in applying data optimization and efficiencies with things like AMR, AMI that also bring another data point or vector for utility can consider as well. And then you have your enterprise systems, where there is a lot of information there that is attractive to bad actors, if you will, whether it's employee payroll systems or your service contracts, customer billing, and things of that nature that have value outside of the space that can be used maliciously for identity theft or even financial transactions, versus on the OT side, where there's more of an operational impact potentially in compromising the mission of the utility. So assuming that those assets are something that the utility values, what I'm arguing here is that they need to be protected and managed appropriately. And so as our footprint as a utility grows beyond the fence line with all these new data points, the Internet of Things, so to speak, that increases our exposure, and that is why we have a need to expand our risk management paradigm. It's a little bit dated, but the point here with these two reference points is to recognize that some of this is incumbent upon not only the utility to manage the assets they have, but also we're seeing some growth, thankfully, by the technology providers to integrate security features into their systems. And the wired thing there with the consumer reports kind of rating of what is good or bad or available, that limits a utility's ability to manage the risk. But as these systems change and more security features are integrated into these PLCs and RTUs and things of that nature, it enables a utility to leverage some of those capabilities. Furthermore, in terms of processes, there are any number of industrial control systems that are just kind of hanging out there on the public internet. Perhaps in part because when they were first installed, the idea of a cyber intrusion through the internet into your operating system was somewhat inconceivable, but we know that that's not as the case, and so from a best practice, good hygiene perspective, we recommend utilities take a look at where their stuff is and make sure it's just not hanging out there in the public domain where anybody can take advantage of it, and it becomes a very opportunistic threat action. And so a lot of that stuff can be taken off the table with just some simple policies and procedures. In the water sector, many of you are hopefully familiar with the American Water Works Association as a standards organization. We have a number of standards and guidance available to utilities to help navigate security and emergency preparedness space. The first two here, G430 and J100, you'll note a little ribbon there next to it under Safety Act. That's just a recognition from our friends at the Department of Homeland Security that these have been deemed to be effective in helping to mitigate the threat of terrorism. And so there's some other liability protections that come along with that. But what I'm noting here with these different guidances and standards is that in all cases we have incorporated from an all-hazards approach the importance of information protection or cybersecurity protection as a key threat or asset that should be managed appropriately. And that includes all the way through on the emergency preparedness and business continuity planning, how to establish things. This was, from a business continuity perspective, this came to bear a little bit after Katrina, when many utilities were impacted, and in the case of the New Orleans Water and Sewer Board, they were asked to reconstruct their most recent billing for purposes of working with FEMA, and all those systems had been flooded out, and there was no backup. And so that made reconstruction of that very difficult. So working through that process of how you recover from an incident like that, whether it's something as simple, quote unquote simple, as a flood or a hurricane, or a more directed malicious attack from ransomware, such as that just experienced by the city of Atlanta, which has had a number of its digital assets corrupted with some ransomware that's really put them in a bind in dealing with some things. And so the balance of my talk here will be focused on this last item, on process control system security guidance for the water sector, which really leans into Matt's talk regarding the NIST cybersecurity framework. But what we have done here is developed at the time some guidance that helps a utility implement and apply the principles in the NIST cybersecurity framework. And what we've done with this, given, and Matt will explain this in more detail about the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is meant to be applicable across multiple sectors, we took and applied this from the sense of how does the utility use or operate their process control system. I need to stress that the guidance is not an evaluation of your current security profile. What it does do is, based on a particular use case, it generates a prioritized list of controls that then allows the utility to determine whether or not that action has been taken or needs to be taken if it's relevant to their current operating system. And of course, if those controls aren't in place, that means you have some exposure and potential vulnerabilities that we would suggest should be evaluated and assessed for corrective action. So we've broken it down a little bit differently here based on utility input into 12 core practice categories, anywhere from governance and risk management, and that comes right back to some of the basic things of, do you have a digital policy? If Bob and Larry are bringing in their cell phones and doing business operations on that, what is your bring your own device policy? All the way down to education and personal security, right? So your front line is really your people. So how are you educating them on how to deal with best practices? Because at the end of the day, with the incident in Atlanta and a more specific incident in the water sector with the Lansing Board of Water and Light, it was a ransomware attack, and those are very easily propagated because, quite frankly, people like to click on stuff. So some of this is a little bit of education and how everybody within the utility can be part of this cybersecurity risk management team. So how do you access this tool and guidance? It's on the AWWA website at awwa/cybersecurity. It's freely available. In order to get into the tool, you would need to generate a customer profile, but again, that's free, and so you can run that tool as many times as you like for whatever asset you need. And really, again, to kind of emphasize how you folks use this, I'm not going to get into all the possible scenarios, but what we found is that utilities that haven't done anything have used this, or have intermittent activity, have used this tool to identify just a basic cybersecurity baseline for the types of things they do, and then they're able to go out and it empowers them to be able to have a conversation about what may need to be implemented and how they can do that, whether that can be something that's done in-house or bring in support from outside vendors that are maybe specialized in a particular type of activity. And then a number of folks use this as part of a larger cybersecurity assessment to validate findings and recommendations, and use it in more of a repetitive process to continuously evaluate where they are and where they might need to take into other considerations, and it feeds into perhaps a longer-term cybersecurity improvements program. So in a nutshell, I would frame what we've developed as kind of a really kind of entry-level baseline to get you in the door, get your head around what you as a utility may need to be doing or thinking about doing, or verify that you're already doing it in alignment with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a voluntary construct, but strongly encouraged. And then as a utility gains in its maturity, there are other resources available from ICS CERT within the Department of Homeland Security based on some of the NIST standards noted there, and a little bit deeper dive into the complexities of your system and the architecture and network within your system. And those are supported by ICS CERT. And my understanding is that the water sector is probably one of the biggest users of some of these things, or that I've been able to track down. But get yourself started with our guidance, and then as you get more comfortable with the issue, go ahead and step into things like CSTAT and some of these other activities that can further enhance your understanding and management of cyber risks that face your system. And with that, that's my contact information, and happy to answer any questions as we get through here, but I will now turn it over to Matt.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Matt Scholl. I'm from the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology. We are a non-regulatory agency under the U.S. Department of Commerce. And why I'm here is because inside the United States government, NIST has the mission of providing the standards, guidelines, tools, and references for securing U.S. non-national security federal information and information systems. And we also have the responsibility for the encryption standards and testing for protecting federal information up through top secret. So inside the federal government, we have a pretty decent cybersecurity role. A few years ago, in recognition of the emerging threat space in the U.S. critical infrastructure, the President at the time signed an executive order asking for a whole-of-government approach to looking at how we can work with and assist the U.S. critical infrastructure in both improving their cybersecurity and reducing the risk space to them. And there were many different approaches and many different agencies involved. NIST's role was to work collaboratively with the critical infrastructure owners and operators to create this framework for improving critical infrastructure. Sometimes we just call it just the framework that was referenced to earlier. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this framework, which is a voluntary framework developed in a public-private partnership with industry over a little over a year time span, and the contents of what this framework is and how it's used, kind of in a nutshell. So I'm working on my lag here. The framework that you could potentially use to assist you in your cybersecurity is made up of three main items. The framework core, which is kind of the structure or the taxonomy on how we talk about cybersecurity. I am not a industrial control engineer or someone who works in the water industry. I am a cryptographer and a cybersecurity professional. I know that I speak a very strange language. And being part of the federal government, I have my own set of acronyms on top of that. And I can potentially even go whole sentences with just acronyms and not even say a full word. So what has happened is sometimes in cybersecurity, the language that we use, the terminology, the expressions are not conducive to having a larger business risk discussion. So one of the things we tried to address in the framework core was to express a taxonomy of cybersecurity that could be used by business professionals that maps all the way down to those specific implementation references from AWWA that were talked out earlier, and then back up again. And I'll show an example of that in a little bit. While that might be good as a generic thing across all critical infrastructures, water is very different than finance, is very different than telecom and healthcare and transportation and all the different sectors. So it is important for individual sectors and even individual companies or organizations within a sector to take that framework core in the blue and bring it over to the green and make a specific profile that is an implementation that reflects your technology, reflects your business requirements, and reflects your risk space as well. So a specified tailoring of that core to create a profile that is most relevant for you. And in the bottom there is something that was called the framework tiers, which is just an assessment of a level of how well you are doing, not just overall, but even within those individual core items as expressed by your profile, because it could be different. You might want to be much better in one area than another, again, based on your technology, your capabilities, or your threat space. So those are the three main pieces of the framework: the core, the profile, and the tiers. This is kind of what the core looks like. On the left side, at the very high level, in that business language, we kind of broke it down into these 5 core areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these are high-level business objectives that can be used at business C-level discussions on what are our priorities and how are we doing to look at our current capabilities as well as what our future telemetry might want to be in these areas. And then as you go to the right, it gets broken down into more specificity directly relevant to cybersecurity, all the way to the right where now the sector should fill in what are those normative references that a sector uses, like those AWWA references or even some of the ICS CERT alerts or references that then also map back up to the left again, with the intent being that your implementation reflected in a profile of those specific AWWA guidance then can get pushed back up to the left, and you can have those repeatable and understandable discussion with your business leaders about this is where I am in cybersecurity, this is why I'm at this current place, and if you want to take us to a different level of capability or capacity, I can have a structured understanding of where I need to go and even potentially what it will do for me for my risks or what it might cost to implement. That's the core. I kind of talked about a profile a little bit. It's, again, the customized core for what it would mean for a sector. And it's important not just for your technology and your threat space, but also to look at each sector has a different regulatory requirement, and each sector has a different business objective and business mission as well. And all of those should get integrated into the creation of a profile. And we've seen profiles created by sectors writ large. For example, communications and the transportation sector have taken a generic core and made a less generic profile for the sector. And then even within that, individual organizations or even within, for example, communications sector, rather than just communications, they did one for what ground-based cable telecom would look like versus satellite LTE communications, for example. Very different based on the technology, therefore the actual implementation would be very different as well. Within the federal government, this is how we create a profile for federal information systems. We go through this risk management framework process to categorize our data, select those normative references. For us, it's from our federal agency guidance rather than something that an organization like AWWA would put out. Then there's an implementation and a testing step, an approval step by those business folks, and then a continuous monitoring phase before we go back in. So this would be the federal agency's method for creating that profile. What does a framework do for you or not do for you? One of the things we wanted to be sure was if you were implementing a cybersecurity program using a disciplined process, AWWA guidance, ISO 27000, COBIT, SANS Top 20, whatever it is that you were using, if it was effective for you, we wanted to not have a requirement that would have you rip and replace with something new. So really what the core of the framework does is it just provides a standardized taxonomy. So if you're using COBIT or AWWA and your vendor comes to you and they're going to express their capabilities or their services using ISO 27000, again, that mysterious cybersecurity language is difficult, even for cybersecurity people to translate. I'm asking for something in AWWA, but my offering is in NIST guidance or in ISO guidance. How do those two map up? Am I getting what I'm asking for? So that common translation layer is extraordinarily helpful if you outsource, if you look to vendors, if you look to service providers for your IT, and not just your IT, but also for the cybersecurity of your IT. So in that aspect, the common and accessible language is extraordinarily helpful, especially for organizations where IT is not their core mission. You can find all of this information and probably more than you're willing to try to digest on our NIST website. Something else we have up there, along with the framework, is those NIST federal references. And then we also have postings where individual organizations or sectors who've created their own profiles have submitted them back to us, and then we hang them off our website as well. So you can look at a company that might be reflective of yourself or reflective of the technology that you use, or a sector, and say, this is how they tailored it. Maybe I don't have to start greenfield. I can start with something a little more specific. So those are some of the assets and resources we offer. And those are the links where you can find them. So that's my Framework 101, and I'll pass it over to John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Good presentation. I want to talk a little bit down deeper than where Kevin and Matt were. I want to look at utility resilience through cybersecurity in the wastewater and water sectors. And resilience is really the development or enhancement of your ability to operate and recover your operations under adverse conditions. So we're looking at natural events like power outages, flood, tornado. We're also looking at human events such as a cyber or physical attack. And in 2003, the water and wastewater systems were included as part of the Homeland Security Presidential Directive, which said you're now one of our critical infrastructures. And any disruption in your ability to provide services has a definite impact on other critical services. I think Matt brought that up. Firefighting, healthcare, energy, food and agriculture, transportation. But also keep in mind, your systems are inherently dependent on both telecommunications and energy sectors, and each of those sectors present their own unique set of vulnerabilities. Because so many systems are interconnected, you need to, just as put in the back of your mind, have discussions with those providers on their implemented level of security. So I'm with Black & Veatch. We're an international corporation headquartered out of Overland Park, Kansas, and we're heavily involved in building that critical infrastructure in the energy, water, telecommunications, and government sectors for over 100 years. My group is focused on performing cyber and physical security compliance assessments, primarily within the energy sector, but we have been repeatedly asked of recent times to get involved with water and wastewater as well. And in doing so, we have a challenge. And that challenge is protecting systems that were really designed with little to no built-in security capabilities. Your SCADA, your DCS, your HMI, your RTUs, your PLCs, they're basically non-IT focused, they're OT focused or operational technology. They're designed for a specific purpose, and you need to protect those systems as best you can. One way of doing that is the systems need to be isolated. You use dedicated firewalls, you restrict internet connectivity, you basically make them an island unto themselves as best as you can. Now that poses another set of problems because that operational data needs to be shared across your enterprise. Your executives want to know how you're doing. Your communications group may need outage information to answer calls from customers. And your CC&B group or your billing group needs to have usage data in order to bill accurately. Your SCADA systems, however, are usually outdated. Unless your facility or a particular part of your plant has come online in the last few years, most of your systems have been in place for many years. And that installed equipment may be incompatible with any contemporary firmware. And many SCADA systems' original software may no longer be supported. Good example is Windows 2003 or Windows XP, because they haven't been supported for years. But we need to look at why OT is a little different. And it's different from IT in that it is focused on a physical process. You have multiple processes throughout your plant, and each one is considered operational, versus IT, which is focused on data and information. And those processes are designed for availability and safety from an OT perspective. From an IT perspective, they're focused on confidentiality and integrity. And you may have heard the term thrown around, it's been around for a long time, the CIA triangle, where you're dealing with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's from an IT's perspective. The OT triangle is called AIC, putting availability first, then integrity and confidentiality. Now, OT systems themselves may be on the order of 10 to 15 years of life, as much as up to 40. And since the IT system's life cycle periods are shorter, don't wait until failure to replace these systems, because they actually help manage your OT infrastructure. So upgrade your laptops and servers according to recommended industry standards. Keep them patched in order to protect your downstream devices. So once you have an established, reliable, and efficient operational service, there's really no need for change in that environment. Typically, your OT systems are designed and remain in operational service up until points of failure. They have long lifespans. The only time you take them offline is during scheduled maintenance, normally annually or 18 months, whatever your cycle is. In an IT world, if you're working on something and the system locks up, you do a reboot. And if it, go get a cup of coffee and come back in 15 minutes and you're usually up and running again and everything is fine. So OT has different concerns requiring different security solutions. So what you need to do is really understand what your critical water and wastewater processes and assets are. Identify your OT systems that interact with those assets, and any non-OT supporting systems that are required. So in this diagram, you see the arrows going from right to left, but I want to start on the left-hand side. I threw a critical asset out there. This is the wastewater. It's your sludge drying process. Could be anything. Your PLCs are in place to control the operations of that. It could be a floodgate. It could be a chemical injection process, anything. And then you have your DCS, your SCADA systems that actually monitor and support the operations of that PLC and process. The center and the left diagrams form your OT environment. Now to the right, you have support systems such as Active Directory or Citrix, say if you need to have remote access, antivirus, event monitoring. There's a plethora of stuff, whatever needs access to that data. Those systems are usually IT focused. They usually have inherent security built in, and they're managed by IT, which is more focused on physical and cybersecurity. But it allows those users access and or update capabilities to critical OT systems. So you need to put something in place that restricts that access or better manages that access going forward. So what I want to do is just kind of leave you with some easy takeaways that we feel are some of the leading practices when you're establishing your security environment. The first is put in some kind of physical or logical separation of your networks. Create something between that OT and non-OT system where practical. Put in firewalls, put in routers, switches, establish a DMZ or demilitarized zone to isolate those OT systems and protect those assets. I put at a minimum, implement layer 3 access controls. Most firewalls have built-in layer 2. Layer 2 basically says, okay, I'm credentialed in this environment. I'm IT. If your network is kind of flat, guess what? I can get over to the OT side. And if you don't have anything on that side that restricts me from touching your systems, I can. And we see that in a lot of instances. So layer 3 takes it one step further, and it says, okay, I'm allowed access over here, but once I'm here, I'm trying to control or minimize the effect of having a non-OT event occur. I keep you out of my systems. The next thing you want to look at is reviewing your access control processes and procedures. Restrict the use of shared accounts. Now, shared accounts are something that the operators have, for instance. Their systems are online 24/7. The next guy that comes in, he just gets on the system and he uses it. And that's all good and well from a operational point of view. But if there are incidences, you don't know who did what and where it occurred. So, for instance, create a separate Active Directory forest dedicated to OT systems, and that puts a little bit of separation and it reduces that risk of compromise of a single shared user account having access throughout the environment. The third thing you might want to look at is implementing endpoint security controls. Apply antivirus protection, software patching for applicable systems. Microsoft puts out that Patch Tuesday. Don't gather them up for 6 months and then apply them all at once. They're out there for a reason, and their reason is to help you protect your environment. There are known vulnerabilities, there's known issues with those systems. Apply those patches as often as you can. Harden your system configurations so that they perform the functions that they're intended to perform, and only those people who need access to those systems can get them. A central logging system is really good. It requires a little bit of resource, but it gives you the ability to review what's happened within your network infrastructure and be able to address issues that you may not know are going on. And lastly, physically or logically deactivate any open, unused ports. This one's key. Security interdependencies exist between IT and OT and physical systems. And even though we're talking about cybersecurity here, don't minimize the risk from physical attacks. For example, you may have PLCs that are located out in an unmanned building whose doors are unlocked and outside of a locked cabinet. If anybody breaches your perimeter security, they can walk right up, plug something into one of those ports, either a fob or a laptop, take control of your network, or inject malware. And it's a real simple fix. If you don't physically lock them in a cabinet, logically lock those ports out. These are some of the things that we use in terms of applying logic when we go in and do assessments. We look at that NIST 830 risk assessment methodology for guidance. We work on the 853 security controls, which Matt talked about. We add to that the 882, which is your industrial controls. And on top of that, in the water sector, we like to apply the G430 PCS, which is your process control system guidance. So those four references are very good background information for how you look at protecting your environment. But I want to throw one other thing out there, and that is this. The most expensive and yet the most important component of any security system is the personnel. Proper training, not only in the operation of those critical assets, but making sure that they have refresher training and they understand what risks are out there in their environment and how they can be proactive in looking for any anomalies that would present risk. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Seth. Here's my contact information if you want to get a hold of me, and we'll be glad to help you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, John, and also to Kevin and Matt earlier. I think these presentations really provide a lot to think about. Certainly steps can be taken to improve cybersecurity within the water industry, anywhere from developing and implementing a framework down to specific actions and anywhere in between. These issues, they're always going to be evolving and advancing. So utility at any stage really of maturity and how they deal with this is going to be able to refresh and reevaluate their approach to cybersecurity. What I'd like to do now is just to open the floor for questions from the audience. So feel free, if you haven't already, to plug in a question that you have. Just to kick things off, I think a good one, John, you were just talking, so I might pull you back in. But a question here, why should a smaller, more rural utility invest in security controls if there's no known risk? Could you comment on that a little bit?
Sure, be glad to. We talk about people, process, and technology as three categories when we look at classifying incidents. And we put people first in that context for a reason. Your personnel, as I mentioned at the end of that last slide, are a critical line of defense for any organization. But they need to be trained to understand security risks and be given the proper tools and knowledge to help combat those risks. So oftentimes people, they don't see themselves as targets. We're out in the middle of some wasteland, and who would be after us? Or what value would this facility be to an attack? Well, first of all, remember what I said. You're now part of the 17 and to you're part of the 17 critical infrastructure organizations as part of DHS, and you need to be able to understand what a credible threat is. But implementing proper security programs will allow utilities to reduce the potential for those disruptions and negative impacts to public health and economic vitality of the community. You're also protecting critical assets that are very costly, very time-consuming to replace. And no matter who you are, if somebody wants to make a statement, there's threat actors out there that may take advantage of you, regardless of where you think you're located within a community or with anywhere within the organization or within the country.
Yeah. Hey, this is Matt. Can I hop on that bandwagon?
Sure.
Yeah. So, small, rural, potentially a target that is not immediately impactful may think you're not on threat radar. But there are threats that are specifically designed and tooled just for small, non-IT focused but heavily IT dependent organizations that are highly transactional. So if you look at something like a Zeus rootkit, which you can buy off the dark web rather cheaply, what they want to do is find organizations like that, root mostly into their customer and payment systems, and then slowly over time just start to drain bank accounts, supplier transaction fees, invoices. And while you think a small utility that's losing, $2,500 a month might not seem to be significant to an adversary, the thing that cybersecurity and technology does is this happens at scale. So $2,500 a month from you, but when you do that to 5,000 or 10,000 folks a month, that becomes extraordinarily attractive to cyber threats who want to infiltrate and use you, small companies, small infrastructure, not just for those types of financial siphoning, but also to leverage your infrastructure to launch the next set of attacks, to hop from or hop to, and then to cover their tracks as they exfiltrate other places. So it's not just you as a piece of infrastructure, but you as a small financial transactional company, you as someone who has assets to either further an attack. Those ransomware attacks are hard to track down because they bounce through unprotected infrastructure. So lots of ways to exploit and use even the smalls.
Yeah, this is, if I could, Seth, this is Kevin. I would just add to that in the sense that to what Matt was just saying. Some of this is extremely opportunistic, and they may not necessarily be targeting a small rural system because it's a small rural system. It's here's an open portal on the internet here. Let's go see what it is. Oh, it's a water utility. Let's go see what we can do, right? And so, the concept of obscurity because you're in the middle of Timbuktu is just doesn't apply in cyberland because it does not require proximity, unlike a physical attack. And so I think it's really important that people take away this notion that you're Smallville, USA, therefore nobody knows where you are. It's a false narrative, and it needs to go away.
Great. Thank you for those comments. One next question I see, I think, John, it's back to you. Could you please comment on unintended consequences of OS and patches on OT systems? They are not necessarily going to have no impact on OT system performance. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, a lot of system upgrades may not work if you have older firmware. I think I mentioned that in one of the slides where if you have a 20-year-old piece of equipment out there like a PLC that's no longer supported, If you are upstream and you're patching your environment and your environment is trying to control that PLC, now there's a break in what it's capable of doing. That's one scenario. If you're looking at if you're looking at some of the connectivity issues that a patch may fix, it may break something downstream. And I don't have an example of that right on top of my head, but we see it all the time when you run some scans on networks. You can break them just by running a scan, because at some point in time, it's an older piece of infrastructure, and you're talking about operational systems that are relatively old. You don't have that opportunity to connect fluidly throughout the environment.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to kind of join, I think, two questions here, and I think, Kevin, I might push this your way. So cybersecurity efforts aren't really regulated, so management will not support mitigation. And how are U.S. utilities approaching and addressing cybersecurity internally? Could you talk a little bit about how that sort of internal process might be going forward or could be improved?
Sure. So I guess I'll take the regulatory point first. And yes, it is true that under the Safe Drinking Water Act and under the Clean Water Act, there is no explicit regulatory requirement related to cybersecurity. However, I would say that if those systems are critical to the mission of the utility, as much as your clarifiers and your settling bases and things of that nature, which you maintain, that your cyber assets require the same due diligence. And so there has been pressure being placed on utilities from insurance underwriters, and the bonding agencies are also asking questions about how entities are managing the cyber risks, whether it's Moody's or S&P. And so not explicit cybersecurity, but the market is putting pressure on systems to take account of that. In addition, there have been some very directed requirements placed on systems in New York and New Jersey, and there's a number of other states that are contemplating similar requirements. So I would say it's coming. So it would be incumbent upon you to take proactive measures to manage that risk, because I think, as Matt was saying, the volume of activity in cyberspace in terms of targeted attacks is growing exponentially on an almost daily basis. And so it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And this is about taking yourself down a couple notches in terms of target attractiveness and managing that risk. What was the second part of the question?
That was how are utilities approaching and addressing cybersecurity internally? Yeah. Right.
And so a lot of systems are taking advantage of some of the resources that have been talked about by everybody in getting a handle on what they're doing. Just had conversation with some utilities here a few weeks ago that had done some audits on their systems to understand where there may be gaps and weaknesses, and taking actions to make it. The key part here is, from an entity that is entrusted with public health and protection of the environment, whether you're drinking water or wastewater system, what are you doing to manage the risks to that mission? And so I would say that if the cyber assets that you have as a utility are not critical to that operation, then turn it off and don't worry about it anymore. I suspect most systems can't do that. Therefore, do what you can to manage that risk. And that's essentially the attack the tactical approach that's being taken, and that's why we provided a resource that prioritizes, recognizing that you can't do everything in the cybersecurity framework all at once. So let's have a logical approach that allows you to kind of do a belt and suspenders, do this first, then do this, and then do that. Because many of these things are kind of successional in the sense that you have to, if you don't have this control in place, then it's not likely you'd have these other controls in place. So it's somewhat sequential. And that's how folks have been trying to take this and get their hands around this beast.
Great, thank you. I think we probably have time for one more, and then I think, Matt, I'm going to direct this towards you, but kind of a two-parter, but pretty practical. How should utilities understand the ROI? How much cybersecurity do they need to invest versus all the other risks that they have to manage?
That is the billion-dollar question, and an excellent one. So I'll speak some cybersecurity heresy here in that, yeah, you have to manage a whole lot of other risks. And cybersecurity may not be the most important risk for you to manage to some extent. You've got, physical and water quality risks that are probably more important, but what do I know? But the point being, cybersecurity as a risk generally is not discussed with those other risks like water quality, customer, delivery, supplier, financial. Those are all corporate level risks, employee risks, legal risk, regulatory compliance risks. Those are all risks that are discussed at that business level. You should have cybersecurity in that discussion at that level. And if you use something like the framework, what you can do is take your profile or your implementation of cybersecurity and say, this is where we are in that corporate discussion. You can push it up to that core level to have that much higher understanding piece rather than talk to them about bits and bytes. And you can say, using that, with this addition, I can change this profile from this to that. And if you can map that against what you believe is your threat space with information from organizations like ICS CERT, for example, you can then have at least the ROI discussion. You can say, this is where my profile is. This is where I want to go with my profile because of these threat things or these compliance things that I see coming or that ICS CERT has told us. And based on the market that I've looked at, this is how much it's going to cost us. And then you can have that discussion, that competing discussion with managing all those other risks. So that's how we've seen the framework used when those corporate investment discussions are happening around that ROI piece.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I know we're just hitting the hour. I don't want to take more people's time than I have to today. So this really concludes today's webinar. I appreciate everyone joining. If you have any questions or feedback, please do contact us. And we'd also like to thank the SWAN Alliance for joining with us and really pushing forward this webinar.